Welcome, everybody, to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. This is one of our open seminars that we have on Wednesdays usually, but it's also a seminar in our ongoing collaboration with the Rutgers Center for Population Level Bioethics. I think this is like the fourth open seminar that we've done, and maybe the sixth seminar in total. And everything has gone very well so far, and I hope it continues to go very well. And I'm happy to introduce our own Krister Bykvist for today's seminar. Krister is a prominent philosopher, defended his dissertation, Changing Preferences, a Study in Preferentialism at Uppsala University in 1999. And he's since become one of the world's leading scholars, maybe the leading scholar on questions of normative significance related to changing preferences over time and across possible worlds. Questions like, how should we determine an individual's well-being in cases of changing preferences? How should the individual act prudentially, and so forth? But his research spans many areas of both practical and theoretical philosophy. So here at IFFS, he's been the PI or co-PI on projects related to, population ethics, future generations, climate ethics, and now a project on the ethics of coordination. He's the author of many papers and a number of books, including Utilitarianism, a Guide for the Perplexed, which I think is a very good guide if you're perplexed, and Moral Uncertainty, together with Will MacAskill and Toby Ord. And he's currently working on many projects, including a book on changing preferences. But today he's going to talk to us about impossibility theorems in population ethics. The title of his talk is Who Should Care About Impossibility Theorems in Population Ethics? So go ahead, Krister.
Thank you so much, Tim. Very kind of you to give such a nice introduction. So this question here, who should care about impossibility theorems in population ethics? Sort of a bit of a personal question. As Tim said, I've been working on population ethics and especially focusing on how to sort of deal with these impossibility theorems. I've had some ideas about perhaps one should try to wheel in some notion of evaluative uncertainty, some methods of how to deal with uncertainty about the value of population change, and then try to do something with that. I published a paper on that. And also I've been thinking about perhaps we should see the conditions to define the impossibility theorems as sort of not an all or nothing thing, but you can perhaps satisfy these conditions to degrees, and that's an unfinished project. But now I'm stepping back a bit and asking myself, is it actually worth doing at all? So who should care about it? If the answer to this question is no one, then I'm in a pickle. And so is actually the director of this institute, Gustav Arrhenius, since he's been actually formulating many different versions of impossibility theorems in population ethics. He's one of the leading theorem creators when it comes to population ethics, impossibility theorems. So the question is that one, and I'm going to focus on a particular answer to this. Let's see if I can get this to work. Sorry. Yeah. And that's the following one. It's from Samuel Scheffler's book, Why Worry About Future Generations, from 2018. And he is actually trying to basically sidestep these theorems because he wants to actually sidestep and avoid trying to construct a satisfactory population axiology. And if you're not in the business of doing that, he thinks you can just avoid impossibility theorems. In fact, he mentioned impossibility theorems once, I think in the footnote, as just a little thing that some people do when they are in the grip of sort of doing population axiology. But he thinks we can avoid all that by focusing on some other aspects of how we should care about future rather than population axiologies. And he also says that sort of it's a typical utilitarian problem. Utilitarians care about the well-being of people, and then, of course, lots of the population ethics has been formulated in terms of well-being. So utilitarians have been interested in these impossibility theorems, or utilitarian-minded or friendly or oriented people have been especially interested in these theorems. So that's true. But as I said, he thinks then we can sort of determine the reasons we have to care about the future people without constructing satisfactory population axiology. And we can then just sidestep the accompanying impossibility theorems. And that would be nice, of course, but not so nice for Gustav and myself, since we think these are important. And in fact, something similar is suggested in some of the reviews of Will MacAskill's book, What We Owe to the Future, or to Over the Future, and also in social media posts, even by prominent moral philosophers. And here's one example from Facebook. He's a very funny, prominent moral philosopher. I have never had any children. Do I regret that? Occasionally. Do I feel moral remorse for it? Of course not. But then I worry that my complacency on this score shows a deplorable lack of respect on my part for the transitivity of better than. For you who actually do not know what impossibility theorems are and what transitivity is, you will not get this joke. So it's quite an in-house joke, but I will actually explain both these things. And after a while, I hope you will actually get this joke, but not now. And I'm not trying to explain it now, because that's spoiling the joke and my talk. So what are my aims today? Yeah, I will show that Scheffler's argument reflects a misunderstanding of the population axiology and possibility theorems, and also that impossibility theorems are, in fact, highly relevant to Scheffler's own account, and that there is no obvious way out of these impossibility theorems for Scheffler himself. Now, this will be boring for people who actually have heard, that's too much, have heard about or know about impossibility theorems, but this is necessary for people who are not so familiar, or perhaps not familiar at all. So in an impossibility theorem, what do you do? Well, you gather certain conditions or axioms, starting points, or conditions on an adequate theory in a certain area, in this case, population ethics. And then you see whether you can actually find a theory that can satisfy all these conditions. And if you cannot, if you can show with logical means that's impossible, you have an impossibility theorem in this area. And here are some standard axioms in the population ethics domain, which have been used to start off this sort of theorems. So one famous principle is the mere addition principle. It says that adding a life with positive well-being makes things at least as good. That either it's indifferent, no difference in value, or it's better. Other things being equal, so no other changes for other people's well-being or any autonomy or whatever. Just other things being equal is important qualification. The second principle is the so-called weak inequality aversion. So increasing average and total well-being while creating perfect equality is an improvement in value. Again, other things being equal, so not changing the number of people, for instance. Third one, avoidance of the repugnant conclusion. So population of lives barely worth living cannot be better than a population of lives with very, high positive well-being. Again, other things being equal. And then there are actually some background assumptions as well. So transitivity, here it comes, of at least as good as. And what does that mean then? Well, the idea is that if A, let's say a population, is better than B, another population, so at least as good as B, another population, and B is at least as good as C, then A is at least as good as C. So same thing as it holds for tallness. If A is at least as tall as B, B is at least as tall as C, then A is at least as tall as C. So it's the same kind of structural requirement on at least as good as we have for at least as tall as. We also need a rich domain of population, so we can sort of move around and have different numbers and identity of people, and also quite a rich structure of degrees of well-being, so we can vary how happy or what kind of positive well-being or negative well-being people have. But I'm not going to get into it. There are also some other assumptions there, actually. And as these are actually very sloppy formulations, they can be made much more precise and formal, of course. That's what you need to do a logical derivation of theorem. But for my purposes, this is enough. And what is the theorem itself? Well, there are actually more than one theorem. So this is then the so-called mere addition paradox. And now we have to do some box ethics. So what we have here is a sort of number of boxes, as you can see, or sort of alternative populations. We can have here A plus, B plus, C, and so on. And if you look into A, let's see, you can see then there is a sort of the rectangle standing on something. Well, that line signifies neutrality. So above that line, we have lives with positive well-being. Below the line, we have lives with negative well-being. And at the line, we have beings with neutral well-being. So in A, you can see that you have a population, very positive, high positive well-being. In A plus, what happens is just that you add this extra population to the right there, so to speak, and they have lower positive well-being, but still positive. In B, what you do is then to sort of equalize, so you drag down the first population in A plus, and you lift the second one, so they have perfectly equal well-being, and also making sure that the total and average well-being is increased from A plus to B. And then basically you repeat this process, B plus to C, and C plus to D, and so on, all the way to omega. And if you do that, you can then use these principles I just listed, and starting off then saying, well, according to mere addition, A plus is at least as good as A, because it's a mere addition there. B is better than A plus, because you have this weak inequality aversion ruling that transition. And then you can use transitivity to conclude that B is it's going to not be flourishing there, it should be better. B is better than A. Now I've told you my trick here up my sleeve. I will showed you my trick. And then you repeat this sort of procedure, and you get the result that omega is better than A. But that is then a repugnant conclusion. And one of the conditions was, of course, to avoid a repugnant conclusion. So that's the sort of standard version, not with more flourishing there, but better than. What is Scheffler's take then on these things? Well, he thinks that you should care about future generations. It's not indifferent at all. In fact, the whole book is about how we should care about future generations. And then he has a sort of a list of different ideas about why we should care about future generations. So one is that it's in our interest, since he claims it's worthwhile to play a part in a collective project that extend into the future, perhaps doing philosophy, contributing to this philosophical discussion, adding your bit to this sort of big project of finding the philosophical truth, if you're into that, or if you're into medicine, contributing to this development of medicine, or if you're into technology, developing technology and doing your bit in that. Of course, that will involve future generation taking over, because some of these projects are not very easy to complete and finish. Let's say philosophy is a good example. And secondly, we are already attached in different ways to the future the future people, future humanity. And it goes through three different kinds. We don't have to get into that. The important point is that all this, and this says that because we have this attachment, we have a reason to care about future generations on one condition, namely that what we care about, namely humanity, has value. So there has to be an attachment independent value of humanity for us to have reason to act on our attachment towards future humanity. Otherwise, value of future humanity did not have any value. We would not have any reason to to care about future generations, even if we happen to be attached to future generations. So this is sort of a condition on this kind of reason. So we need an attachment independent value of humanity. Yeah. So he thinks then that the value of humanity gives us reason to desire to actually have this attachment. And what kind of desire? Well, a desire that the chain of generations should be extended into the indefinite future, and that our successors should be able to live under conditions conducive to their flourishing. And he also adds that these value-based reasons are not hostage to our ability to construct satisfactory population axiologies. That's a very important addition, right? That's the claim that we can sort of then use to sidestep the impossibility theorems, because there he claims they are just something that these people doing population axiology should worry about. So more exactly, population axiology then, according to Scheffler, he has a definition of this, and it's inspired by Hilary Greaves' Philosophy Compass article, has the following elements. So first of all, it's a total world state axiology. So the idea is that we value the total states of the world, so it includes the past, the present, and the future. And these states are valued in terms of the distributions they contain of individual well-being. And individuals can then, the populations here in these states can differ in number of people or identity or both. It's also assumed to be universal. So all possible total states are assigned a value. It's supposed to be complete. So all states can be compared in value. And it's supposed to ground reason to promote the optimal population world, so the optimal states of worlds where we have the highest value in terms of the well-being distributions of the populations in that world state. So that's quite a package here, so to speak. It's quite so that's important to remember that actually Scheffler has a very specific view about what population axiology is, and it's this idea. And that, as I said, very specific. In fact, I think it's too specific, because there are actually alternative axiologies, population axiologies out there. So, for instance, Gustav Arrhenius, he talks about populations and comparing the value of populations rather than the values of states of worlds. And John Broome talks about distributions of well-being in an abstract sense, ordered sets of individual welfare levels. And also some frameworks like Gustav's, completeness is not assumed. I mean, you can add that, but it's not assumed in the framework. It doesn't define an axiology. And also, it's not often assumed that you must have a reason to promote the optimal population. Well, you don't have to assume that, because that's the reason to do something. And of course, axiology is about value. Of course, there can be connections between value and reason to do, but it doesn't have to be a very straightforward connection, not the one that Scheffler assumes. So these are the alternative ways to understand population axiology. It's good to have that in mind. But what is then the sort of sidestepping argument, the argument Scheffler presents, which will then, if successful, show that he doesn't have to care about impossibility theorems, because he's not in the business of constructing satisfactory population axiology. Well, he claims the following: determining the value of humanity does not require the construction of a satisfactory total world state axiology about humanity. And he makes a general point. In fact, he says that determining the value of an X does not require the construction of satisfactory total world state axiology about X. And for X, then he thinks about instances like baseball, friendship, music, poetry, Shakespeare's plays, and so on. And I think he's onto something here. I think that the general point is true. It's true that in order to determine the value of an x, that doesn't, for any x, doesn't require that you construct a satisfactory total world state axiology about x. And one example would be this this is drawing on Scheffler's own argument here or reflection. So think about the total world state axiology of baseball. So in order to determine the value of baseball games, we do not seem to need to have an ordering of total world states in virtue of the distributions of past, present, and future baseball games and their values. And the same holds for, I think, friendship, music, poetry, and Shakespearean plays. So I think the general point is true. But perhaps that doesn't show that, of course, perhaps it's a special case, the value of humanity, right? And perhaps that's different. Humanity is different in a way from these other items, friendship, music, and poetry. So it can still be true that perhaps for humanity still we need a world state axiology. In fact, I think there are some arguments that one could present that would pretty strong show that actually. But here I'm not going to assume that. In fact, I'm going to be neutral on that and just look at this sort of the Schefflerian way of looking at things, basically, the perspective from Scheffler, and basically ask ourselves, so even if determining the value of humanity does not require satisfactory total world state axiology, I will argue that it does require satisfactory value of humanity axiology. So more generally, the idea is that determining the value of an x requires a satisfactory value of x axiology. Of course, it needn't be universal or complete or very precise, but it has to be some kind of account, some kind of explanation of why certain x is good x or why a certain y is a bad y and so on. It doesn't have to be very complete. As I said, it can be quite minimal, but still some account, and has to be, of course, be satisfactory as well. And so, for example, then determining the value of baseball or games or athletic performances or teams requires a satisfactory value of baseball axiology. And I actually went online to check baseball axiology, and there are quite a few websites, of course, in the US mainly, where they basically focus on this, trying to figure out ways to, list all the good makers for baseball games or baseball teams or athletic performances, and then also various aggregation procedures to sort of aggregate and trade off various different features, sort of good making features of baseball games against each other, and then come up with an overall assessment of baseball games and baseball teams as well. So this is something people are doing, people into baseball. So I'm not just dreaming up something here. And I think that's exactly what needs to be done if you will take seriously the value of baseball, for instance. So if you're with me on that sort of general idea that determining the value of x requires a satisfactory value of x axiology, then of course we can then ask yourselves that will also, we can note that will follow, it follows from this, that it will also hold for the case where x is humanity. So we need a satisfactory value of humanity axiology. Now, Scheffler doesn't say very much about humanity or the value of humanity exactly. He gives some just, as I said, something about the flourishing basically being important. But he does refer to Johann Frick on the survival of humanity. And on Frick's view, humanity has value since it produces and appreciates objectively valuable things such as art, music, and scientific knowledge. And the value of humanity is determined by its state of flourishing. And I think this is something Scheffler would take on board as well, partly because he actually referred to it and with the sort of sympathetic nodding. But then, of course, again, we have this notion of flourishing then. And as you know, that's quite a big debate about exactly flourishing means. So here I'm just going to assume some bare bones taken from Tom Herka's work, and he's here, I guess this is just summarizing, I think, what most people think about flourishing. So most people, I think, would say that humanity flourishes when it develops its unique or essential features to a sufficiently high degree. So it has to sort of be a sufficiently high degree of artistic achievement, musical achievement, or scientific knowledge, or importance of scientific knowledge. So that's the very minimal idea I will work with and in the following. So what does the value of humanity axiology say then about human flourishing, the flourishing of humanity rather? Well, I guess it depends on individual flourishing, right? So as Scheffler says, successors should be able to live under conditions conducive to their flourishing. And successors are, of course, individual humans. But you can also have an idea that there are some collective achievements which no one individually could have brought about. And that will add to the flourishing of humanity as a whole, but perhaps not add as much, or perhaps a little bit, to the individual involved in making this happen. Perhaps it will just be a part of that flourishing value, depending how much work they put in and how much they contributed to this collective achievement. So there can be sort of it's not just a function of, I think, individual flourishing in a very clear sense. It can be something that happens when lots of people get together and can do something they could not have done individually. And also, I think its size, I guess, matter to some extent, right? So, as you say about any species, if it's sort of too small, the population, we wouldn't say it's flourishing, especially if it's too small to actually sustain a critical number of members of the species. So I think that's something that's would be relevant for humans too. Here, I think it's quite a reasonable assumption in this kind of value of humanity axiology. Right. So now I want to then argue that the impossibility theorems that Scheffler would like to put aside, of course, he's not in the business of doing population axiology in this Schefflerian sense. I will then say that they are actually relevant to Scheffler's account. I mean, there are different alternative ways to show that. So, for instance, one could claim that every plausible moral theory needs a welfarist total world state axiology, namely an axiology that talks about the value of the world and how it depends on the value of individual well-being. And why? Because welfare matters, and any plausible moral theory should then take this into account. But actually, and in fact, Scheffler, I guess, is one case in point. He doesn't think that, and he argues actually against it to some extent. And there are also other arguments against it. So some people don't believe in this kind of final value simplicator, which quite often are wheeled in here to sort of used to describe the value of world states, that they are sort of finally valuable, finally better than another world state. And also the account of beneficence might be very different from so this welfarist utilitarian friendly one. In fact, that's where Scheffler himself is quite involved and thinks that that's true. So we shouldn't be guided by the utilitarian view about beneficence. There are other alternative ways to understand beneficence. And so that's sort of a reply to this, that every moral theory should have a welfarist total world state axiology. The third one, though, is interesting, and it's not actually discussed by Scheffler, namely that you can transform these axioms into sort of geontic analogues in terms of ought to be chosen rather than, for instance, or more reason to cherish or something like that. And Gustav Arrhenius have done with the ought to be chosen rather than, and showed that you can, at that level too, the geontic level, not the relative, but the geontic level, you can show that we have an impossibility theorem. So I'm not going to focus on that. So I'm just mentioning that there are these alternative ways to show that impossibility theorem should be relevant to Scheffler too. As I said, the second one here, he wouldn't resist, right? But the third one, he doesn't discuss at all. And I think it's something everyone has to look into. But I'm going to focus on the first one, namely a value of humanity axiology cannot avoid dealing with the theorems. That's my focus, and that's what I'm going to discuss now. And now again, I'm going to use boxes here. So it's going to be a box model, but now for the value of humanity and not the world state population axiology. So the boxes I'm going to use represent states of flourishing of humanity, seen as some kind of entity in its own right. And this flourishing of humanity depends, as I said, on individual flourishing and other kinds of flourishing, which can be a function of the collective achievements. I will keep constant. I'm not going to get into those complications. So what we have here, instead of a model of total states of the world, we have a model of states of humanity. The height of these boxes will be degree of individual flourishing rather than degree of well-being. The breadth of the boxes will be the number of humans, so that's not different from the two previous framework. And the ordering relation here will be better state of flourishing or more flourishing state, rather than better or finally better. So we can actually avoid then this discussion that it doesn't make sense to talk about finally better. So better state of flourishing, more flourishing state must be a notion that Scheffler is willing to accept. And here then is the first move here, namely to show that it looks like we have axioms about flourishing that looks, well, structurally similar or identical to the ones for well-being. So here's the mere addition principle now applied to flourishing, namely adding a flourishing life makes humanity at least as flourishing, other things being equal. Weak inequality aversion, increasing average and total individual flourishing while creating perfect equality of individual flourishing is an improvement of the flourishing of humanity, other things being equal. Avoidance of repugnant conclusion. A state with barely flourishing lives cannot be more flourishing than a state with very flourishing lives, other things being equal. And then, of course, background assumption. And here again, it pops up this transitivity assumption, but now applied to at least as flourishing rather than at least as good as. And looking at them like this, of course, details, your view about flourishing, of course, might make a difference here, but at this sort of abstract level, they look as plausible as the one for well-being. Because again, of course, well-being, you can have different accounts of well-being, and if you look closer, you might think that some of these conditions should be given up, even if you talk about well-being. But abstractly seen on this sort of high level altitude, it looks like pretty plausible conditions. Or at least if you want to deny one, you have to say why. And if you accept them, of course, then you do get a sort of a flourishing version, or that's not the right word, a mere addition paradox applied to flourishing rather, where you just make the same sort of transitions, so to speak, but now with flourishing in mind rather than well-being. So A plus is at least as flourishing as A, according to the new mere addition applied to flourishing. B is more flourishing than A plus, according to this weak inequality aversion applied to flourishing. And transitivity here then implies B is more flourishing than A. And then you continue the whole thing down to omega and say omega is more flourishing than A, which is a sort of repugnant conclusion for flourishing. Note, of course, that here the line is not dividing between positive well-being and negative well-being. It's a bit dividing between flourishing and withering. I don't know what the opposite of flourishing is, but not the term for it, but withering, let's say withering. And then you have this line, which is sort of a cut-off point between the flourishing and withering lives. So that's how you should read these diagrams. So it looked like we sort of recreated the mere addition paradox in this new framework, which only talks about the value of humanity, doesn't talk about the world states or populations, in fact, only the humanity and the flourishing states of humanity and how that affects the value of humanity. So A plus B here, of course, are then humanity. Of course, it's very toy model to see humanity is like A, the whole humanity. Yeah, so this is very simplified, of course. You can make it more complex. Ways out, because you might think, well, it's just obvious. Well, one view, of course, is the average view, but deny the mere addition principle. So say that, addition lowers average, which it will do, right, going from A to A plus, and therefore it's not at least as flourishing. It actually worse in terms of flourishing. So that's one way to go. give up that view, condition. Another condition to give up is the mere, another reason to give up mere addition principle is they think that there's a kind of critical level when it comes to degrees of flourishing. And below that level, if you add people at that level, you make things worse in terms of the flourishing of humanity. And then if you set the level at some point here, at some point in this series, you will then have an addition of people, mere addition of people whose flourishing will be below the critical level. And that will then actually not be at least as flourishing for humanity. It will be a worsening in terms of flourishing of humanity. Or you could give up the weak inequality version and say at some point in this series here, the highest flourishing aspects of a human life are lost and cannot be compensated for. So let's say at some point here, perhaps just to have something to look at, B plus to C, perhaps these two first subpopulations, then if you drag them down to the level at C, they lose something there, which cannot be compensated for by the increase of the flourishing levels for the other third subpopulation. So that's another view, another way to give up one of the conditions. And of course, as you can see, these ways out are being discussed in this population ethics, when it also in the application to well-being, of course. So this is not just something for the flourishing framework, but also for the welfarist framework. And people have been arguing for and against this kind of ways out. And as you also know, there's no sort of agreement on which view to go or which condition to give up. And also, if, unfortunately, even if you sort of find an argument to give up one of these conditions, then there are other issues that pops up. So for instance, if you do think you should go for the average view and then deny the mere addition principle for that reason, you will have problems with the so-called sadistic conclusions, which Arrhenius talks about a lot in his book, and coined the term as well. So look at these sort of A and B states of humanity here, so to speak. Then you can see, and alpha there is supposed to be and if you look at the look at the averages between B and A, then B will actually be better than A in terms of average. But in B, we're actually adding withering lives, and in A, we're adding flourishing lives. Even though they are not very flourishing, they're still flourishing, right, above the line, right? So it looks strange or sadistic in the term that, so this conclusion is from the welfarist well-being discussion, but you can sort of apply it here too. It looks strange to say that you should prefer, or it's better that to have, in terms of the flourishing of humanity, to add withering lives rather than flourishing lives, other things being equal. And the critical level will also have this result. In fact, if you look at the critical level alpha here, and you look at the sort of differences between the second subpopulation, the one with low flourishing level in A, and the differences between each individual and the A critical level, and sum those up, to go for that account, critical level account, which is quite often account people go for, and compare that with what is the result of the same procedure for B, you can see that the sum of these differences will be greater in A than in B. So again, it will show that we should go for B. B is more flourishing, in that sense, better than A, even though in B you add withering lives, and in A you add flourishing lives. So from the frying pan into the fire. So what about the perfectionism? Well, there's actually many different kinds of perfectionism, very different sort of versions of it. So, but one sort of general concern, I guess, it's about trade-offs, basically. So if you have this idea that you can sort of, at some point in this series of transitions in the mere addition paradox, some people will then lose some higher order flourishing aspects, and they will never be compensated by a lower life with the other lives, with like increasing it for other lives. then it looks like it's committed to something that has implications for many cases, right? For instance, even individual cases for an individual life. But is it really true then that a loss of a higher flourishing aspect can never be compensated by longer life, for instance, with slightly lower flourishing aspect for the same person? That seems to be a very rigid view about flourishing for individual humans, which seems to be connected to this view, as I said. For instance, perhaps I can survive longer, but not be able to appreciate philosophy, but I will enjoy sports for a long time, and athletic achievements of certain kinds. That might still be a way to continue my life in a more flourishing way. But perfectionists seem to have issues, then we'll have to say stop at some point. No, we cannot. There are other issues too with perfectionism, but we can come back to that in the discussion. So what I just want to say here is, of course, I'm not sort of giving very rough, I'm giving only very rough arguments to show that, look, there are these axioms, and they seem to, from an abstract perspective, to be as plausible as the one for well-being. But here's about the flourishing of humanity and what happens when you change the distribution of flourishing, individual flourishing. And you have then the same kind of paradox, but now in terms of flourishing. You have the same kind of ways out, right? But you also have the same kind of frying pan, from the frying pan into the fire. And here are some examples. So basically, sure, I mean, it's not saying that you're welcome to use this framework, of course, and I think they should use it, but it's not like you can just sidestep these issues about impossibility theorems. You just have to sort of see them in a different way. They are now actually representing something different, namely the value of humanity in terms of flourishing states, rather than the world state of this value of the world states in terms of individual well-being. But you still have an issue. You still have to sort of find which axioms to reject. You still have to sort of have reason for that and so on, and avoid other implications like the sadistic conclusion and so on. Yeah, so I guess I've started already giving some summary remarks here, right? So I think Scheffler is right. We don't have to construct satisfactory total world state axiology just because we assign humanity value. Or at least I would say, he has a sort of a case for that. As I said, there might be some arguments that perhaps we could do that because humanity is different from friendship and so on, right? But what's important here, that assuming that is right, assuming that we don't need to do this, right? We still have to construct a satisfactory value of humanity axiology. And I sketch one here, which is sort of inspired by Frick, namely that you look in terms of flourishing states of humanity. So humanity's value is determined by these flourishing states. But then you have these sort of various different distributions of individual flourishing, and you will then need to sort of think about how that will affect the value of humanity. And you have these axioms, which seem to be, as I said, pretty okay, or as okay for flourishing as for well-being. And then we have to deal with impossibility theorems in terms of this kind of value. The total states of the world are here replaced by flourishing states of humanity. Of course, in order to find a way out, we need to then know, among other things, how to compare different flourishing states of humanity, how the flourishing of humanity depends on individual human flourishing, and how much of this collective achievement stuff matters, which I just put aside, of course. So there are, interesting questions to be explored here, no doubt. And I think one should explore them. And to some extent, Johan Frick, for instance, has explored them. But my point is just that it's not a way to sort of focus on the value of humanity. It's not a way to avoid to deal with this annoying, irritating impossibility theorems. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Excellent. So now we're going to enter the Q&A session. And I think, so usually when we do these seminars, we do them in a hybrid format. and then the chair and the co-chair have different duties. So the one pays attention to questions in the room and the other to questions online. But I think maybe in this particular circumstance, there's no need for such a division. So Kareem, would you do the honors of handling the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. Johan, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I wonder about the avoiding repugnant conclusion in the flourishing version. So, but it seems like once you talk about flourishing, there's sort of a built-in critical level that it's not just lives that are barely worth living. You still grant that they're flourishing. So, is it really problematic to just give that one up?
Yeah, good. So that's a difference. As I said here, right? The omega world is not can hardly be a world in which you have lives barely worth living, right? Because that seems to be inconsistent with them being sufficiently having sufficient achievements that makes it flourishing rather than withering, right? Exactly. So it's not the same repugnant conclusion. I guess perhaps the repugnant conclusion in the case of well-being is stronger or more.
Yeah. What's repugnant about the world with lots of flourishing people?
No, so no, there's this idea that it's just above the sort of level of flourishing, just about to be able to flourish, right? And then, of course, if you set that very high, that's one possibility, right? So to be flourishing, it's not. But I think I'm not sure they do that. I mean, it depends on your views about flourishing, actually. Yeah. So if you set it, the higher you set it, the less intuitive the avoidance of requiring conclusion will be, right? But if it can be set, if the theory of flourishing admits it to be just about the just about sort of it's a small step for humanity, very small step. Then you might still think it's weird that there should be. I mean, of course, each life is flourishing, right? But a tiny little achievement, tiny compared to A, where you have this fantastic achievements. I think it's not still odd, even from the flourishing perspective, to think that having these tiny achievements, perhaps, compared to this population where you have fantastic achievements, still the omega should be better.
But it's still less repugnant than what totalitarianism will.
So it's true. So it's not, as I said, it's this life which is flourishing can hardly be barely worth living. Exactly. So it's not that kind of right. But it's still true that the comparison between a smaller population with fantastic human achievements, really high level of flourishing, and then say, well, go for this other population. Why? Yeah, because it's a tiny achievement. They live for a few minutes or a very short life, but they have a little tiny achievement each. Now that's much better in terms of flourishing of humanity. I don't think the flourishing people would be very happy. Flourishing philosophers would be happy about that. But there might be something to have a bullet to bite, of course. Yeah. And it might be easier to bite that bullet than the one for welfare. Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Okay, are you satisfied with that, Johan? Okay. Dan, you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
Is that a question for Dan?
Yes, I'd be happy to just express my question verbally. In terms of the various axioms in these impossibility theorems, one could just sort of plug in value rather than well-being. And it seems like if we have any kind of value at all that we're assessing states of affairs for, we can run the impossibility. And so if Scheffler is only rejecting this, total value notion, then it seems like your response is fully adequate, and indeed, like all the best arguments seems, in retrospect, quite obvious. So the question is, might Scheffler in fact want to do something more radical and deny that any sort of axiology should govern us here? I mean, maybe that's a nonsensical idea, but it's at least something that I wonder whether one might explore in defending Scheffler.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I should have been clear about that point. So I did sort of suggest that perhaps a value of humanity axiology will provide us with a sort of world state axiology. And I think you hinted at that now, right? One way it could be, namely just replace flourishing in these sort of axioms, the world state in the ordinary axioms. So if we go back to just to have them in front of us, we go back to these ones, right? So we just replace positive well-being with flourishing, right? And now, but the idea is that, of course, we are talking about a world state axiology. So when we look at these boxes, these A and A plus and B will be possible worlds, right? We just replaced well-being of individuals with flourishing of individuals. That's, of course, the easiest way to just say, look, Scheffler, you have to think about this, right? Because, well-being, yeah, that's usually the way we formulate the axioms. But in fact, as you said, it can be any kind of value. For instance, flourishing. You just replace positive well-being, as I said, with flourishing here. But that was and I said, okay, I didn't say anything about that. I just put that aside and said, perhaps that's not true. At least he has to acknowledge that if humanity has value, there must be something that makes humanity have this value. And flourishing states was the idea I got from Frick, which is something that he refers to Scheffler himself. But notice that that's not just to replace, right, positive well-being here with the flourishing and then keep A and A plus as being states of the world. No, it's more radical. It's actually saying that we are now evaluating an entity, humanity, which is containing all the individuals, past, current, and present, and in virtue of some features. Which features? Flourishing states. How are these flourishing states determined? Well, in terms of individual flourishing and possibly collective achievements. That's a very different view because it's not in the business of assigning value to worlds or states of the world or populations, but actually to this entity humanity. Of course, there's an issue about what that entity is. Some people think it's the species, perhaps. And as you might know, that's a view in philosophy of biology that species are some kind of individuals as well. So that's one way to go. So that was the kind of framework I had in mind, not just this sort of simple replacing well-being with flourishing in the original framework, because as I said, that's pretty clear that you get problems, or you get the same problems, right? This was supposed to be a bit more radical, namely just looking at, taking on board this idea that it's humanity that's the value bearer, but the humanity has some kind of features that makes this entity have value, and flourishing states are those features, and then we'll have these variations of different kinds of flourishing states for humanity, and then we have to decide on how to compare them, humanity in those different states, and how that will affect the value of humanity.
If I could just follow up very briefly, suppose we didn't fill in the blanks. So
Yeah.
we have, there's something or other that's a value of humanity. Can't we just run these axioms without putting in flourishing? So whatever it is that makes humanity, it seems to me once we've accepted that we're concerned with the value of humanity, it doesn't really matter whether we say it's flourishing or we say it's I know not what. It would seem as if we could still formulate these axioms.
Yes, if you go for the when I talked about the value of humanity is determined by its states of flourishing. This is what I got from Scheffler, since he talks about flourishing, making sure that people flourish. And he refers to Frick, which and he explicitly talks about states of flourishing. As I said, it can be some other property of humanity. That's true. So you could, this new framework I'm suggesting could be some other property of humanity. But in this, what they seem to have in mind is states of flourishing, both Scheffler and Frick. That's why I focused on that. But as you can see, it's sort of a more radical departure from state-world axiology, right? I'm forgetting about the world of the state, the value of states of the world. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm just interested in the value of humanity. But then you have an issue about which properties of humanity will make humanity good or more flourishing, or so on. And that's where you get into this new axioms and a new impossibility theorem. I should also say that you said, I think, that perhaps it's denying axiology completely. I think that would be odd, right? Because sure, you can deny perhaps that you should have a complete, precise, universal axiology for any x, right? It can be gaps, it can be imprecise, and so on, surely. But as I said about the baseball games, which is an example he uses, that's an example where people really get into the details of what makes a game better than another game, and also how to aggregate these features. So there people are constructing what they think are satisfactory axiologies of the value of baseball. And it would be odd, not to do. And of course, when it comes to music, we have a whole, industry of that too, right? How to find the right good makers of pieces of music, and also how to weigh them against each other. So.
Okay. Nir, go ahead, and then we have Adam.
Fantastic. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Very, very fruitful to certainly pose the challenge your way, Krister. 1 point against Scheffler, and 1 point to try to help Scheffler. So one way that you could even maybe bolster your attack is, one could try to argue that the need to assess the total value of the world, which, as you point out, and as he points out, and you agree, doesn't arise for anything of value, does tend to arise for flourishing in a way that it doesn't arise for well-being of humanity. And the reason why it arises for the flourishing of humanity is that it's a measure of how, the accomplishments that people have in terms of making beautiful things, etc. And you could argue, if people make the dark side of the moon that more beautiful in a way that won't even affect any person's well-being, but still make the world a better place, make the world a prettier place, that is an accomplishment that should go into the list. So basically, for his particular interest, namely the flourishing of humanity, the total value of the world does happen to be relevant. So that would be kind of, making the challenge for him even harder. I don't know what you think about that. Shall I quickly give the challenge for you, or?
Yeah, can I briefly? Yeah, so I think that's sort of similar to Dan's point, right? That sort of, you could just sort of think about the good makers of worlds in terms of individual flourishing. And it seems to be at least one candidate for that, right? Might be other things too, of course. But I mean, it doesn't seem to be strange to say, as I said, right, that the world can be better in one respect in virtue of including some flourishing human individuals. So that's a question I sort of left open, so to speak. I didn't answer that. I think you're right, actually, and Dan too. But I wanted to, even if we sort of bracket them, right, and just look at this sort of entity humanity, which is supposed to be assigned value in virtue of what? Well, some properties of it, right? What? Right. Flourishing states. And then I went for that account.
Okay, thank you. That may well be the case. I had to kind of not listen to the discussion with Dan because I was trying to write thought that I was supposed to write my question in the chat. So
I see. Okay.
Dan is right. The challenge for you, as follows. Scheffler could try to argue, I think that was my understanding when I read him, but you know, who seem to have read him kind of more carefully. I thought that for him, if we must project him to your graphs, the width of the bar is not the number of people with flourishing lives, but rather the number of accomplishments we want to count and anti-accomplishments we want to count. So, you know, middling accomplishments is low bar and things like that, but it's the number of actions. Now, why would that make any difference? So the question would be whether, you know, one great, you know, the funniest movie ever is, if you add to it 1 billion daddy jokes, is kind of worse accomplishment overall or better accomplishment overall. Because when it comes to accomplishments, I think sometimes aesthetics is weird, and sometimes when you mix two things independently of value together, the result is of less value in the combination. I'll give you two examples. They're maybe a little demagogical, but one is, pea soup is great, rose hip soup is great, but try to mix them together, it's not very good. Or maybe a pig is great in many respects, or okay at least in many respects. A golden ring is great, but to put a golden ring in a pig's nose is kind of bad taste. It doesn't work together. So that could create complications and potentially ways for him to kind of avoid the challenge.
Good. Yeah, so there were 2 points there. Right? One was sort of, why do I focus on individual lives, right? In fact, the flourishing of individual lives and how that affects the flourishing of humanity. That's the way I set it up. Couldn't you rather go directly from individual achievements, right? From different lives, right? And then directly to the flourishing of humanity. Why do we have to go through individuals? Because that was the way I sort of represented it, right? So it, and I think you're right that sort of, I don't really have to go for that. I mean, this could be, as I said, individual additions of flourishing, right? Additions of individual achievements of different degrees, right? Could be in the same life, could have one life, right?
Yeah.
We could have a mini humanity of one person. And we can have different states of this one human, the only human ever, and then different states. And here are the possible states of this human. Right. Yeah. To make it a real toy model. And then you can see how you can do it in your way too, right? And still you have an issue about how to deal with it, and for the single human humanity case. The second point was about interaction effects, and that's of course true for even the meridation principle for well-being, right? Adding a positive life can of course change things. So then, other things being equal, of course, is a quite an important qualification. The question is, what does that include then, right? I, for simplicity, just sort of put aside this sort of collective achievements, but I should have also then put aside or said that, look, there's no interaction effects in this particular series. So in order to show that there's a paradox, I need to find one series of this kind, right? I can still accept there can be interaction effects of certain kinds, but in this particular case, there will not be any such interaction effects. The same thing with well-being, right? So adding happy lives might have some interaction effects with put together with the background of happiness, right? But you might then say, well, always in every single meridation or not, right? For instance. So I think I should definitely take that in. Actually, I presented this before and someone did bring this up. I forgot it. I need to go back to and take this seriously. Yeah, because but also, as I said, it's also an issue for the well-versed framework, in fact. So what you need for the paradox to have some sort of grip on you here is just that we can find one series of this kind where you can do these mere additions without there being any interactions.
So ideally, you would have an argument as to why some collection of accomplishments is not amenable to the sort of effects I mentioned.
Yeah, so I mean yes, it would be hard to say that you have interaction effects all the time, whatever, no matter which achievement you add, so to speak. That would be an odd view, right? I mean, it's possible in terms of well-being too, right? Of course. So one view is to give up mere addition. Well, here's one interaction effect which has been used to argue for giving up mere addition in welfarist framework, namely inequality, right? So going from A to A plus in terms of well-being is creating inequality of the bad kind. Some Larry Temkin has said, right? Then, of course, the issue is, okay, so it's worse in one respect then, I guess, right? Which has to do with a sort of certain interaction in the sense of, this relation between the subpopulation's level of well-being. So that's one respect in which it's worse. But is it worse, all things considered, in terms of well-being? That's the issue for Larry, right, and others. Do they really want to say that it's overall worse? I mean, it's worse in one respect, I guess, but is it really overall worse? And as you know, there are other theorems of this kind where actually you don't have to add the A plus subpopulation at such a low level. You can be higher, in fact, and you can have but we don't want to get into that. But that's the sort of challenge for that view. And of course, you have the same challenge for the flourishing view if you go for inequality as being the always present interaction feature of every addition of a lower flourishing life. You have the same issue. Is it sort of overall less flourishing for humanity? We can agree it's one respect, less flourishing, of course, but is it overall? So my point is just, sure, here's a way to go, but this is what we discuss in population ethics. It's a big discussion, right? Larry Temkin has written a whole book about this kind of cases, and lots of the discussion had to do with actually population ethics cases, differing the number and identity of people. But I should definitely say much more about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's Adam is next. Go ahead. And then we have Tim.
Great. So thanks a lot for this, which is very thought-provoking. And one thought it provoked was the following. Might we reject mere addition for the following reason? So, this is inspired, we talked a lot about Frick. This is inspired by stuff Frick says in On the Survival of Humanity. Might we just say that A plus is incommensurate in flourishing value with A? Maybe we say, when we add another person, we're getting a different flavor of flourishing, but it's not better than, worse than, or equally good in terms of flourishing. It's just a different type of flourishing. Now, maybe we can't say this for any population. Maybe we need a certain number of people in the population in order to get flourishing. But once we've got enough, maybe the next person just changes the flavor of flourishing and doesn't make it better than, equal to, or worse. Could we do that?
Yeah. And of course, the same move has been done in the welfarist framework. So some people say that, we can't compare the A plus with A in terms when you have well-being instead of flourishing here. And there's a whole discussion whether that's why, of course, and also a whole discussion about what happens then in other cases where we have different number of people. Will it be too many gaps? So that's one of the worries, that this gap will actually spread, and we will have too many of them. And we will have gaps where we don't want to have the gaps, basically. Of course, it depends on your justification for this particular case. Why is A plus incomparable to A? But some accounts definitely lead to a really radical spread of incomparability, which means that you can't compare future developments for humanity. Just have to be, okay, can't be compared. And that might be too much, right? But again, that's sort of analogous to the debate in the other framework. And there are worked out ideas and proofs about how this will spread given certain assumptions. So they should take that into account, and make use of it. That's my
I just wonder whether the
invitation.
gap
Yes,
is a problem.
yeah,
on
yeah.
the-
So this is, it's more like an argument to show that, look, these discussions in a sort of standard welfarist population ethics and what impossibility theorems can be mirrored and should be mirrored in the flourishing of humanity discussion. It hasn't been so much. A little bit, I guess Johan actually has been doing a little bit, but Scheffler and others have been sort of dismissive of the usefulness of doing it at all, or setting it up in this kind of way. And I think that's unfortunate, because even if you think, in fact, even if you think it's quite a clear way to get out of the paradox, it will actually show you the limits of certain theories and a way to characterize different theories too, what they can do and what they cannot do. And you cannot see that unless you actually formulate these theories in terms of the axioms they satisfy and see whether these axioms actually are consistent. So those are not sort of things you can just see intuitively. You actually have to set these things up. And I think I'm inviting the value of humanity crowd to just come in and use the framework, but put in new content and go ahead.
Yeah, that's convincing to me. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Tim.
Thanks. It's a good talk. I guess I have two comments. One is, I guess, trying to push back and maybe defend Scheffler a little bit, or at least a possible version of Scheffler. And then the other one is trying to kind of show that things might be even worse for him than you suggest. So the first comment has to do with the neutral level for flourishing. So I have a linguistic intuition, and I don't want to hang very much on this intuition. Maybe it doesn't matter that much, but it's not clear to me that there is such a thing as negative flourishing. Like, you introduced this term withering, and I agree that when I think about well-being, I think there's such a thing as negative well-being. So if flourishing has well-being as a part, then I think, there can be negative flourishing. But when I think of flourishing in other terms, it's not so clear. So maybe when I think of it in terms of achievement, maybe there is a negative for achievement. Maybe there's like, maybe fuck-ups are like the negative side of achievement. But when I think of specific achievements, it's not clear to me that there is a negative dimension. So if I'm thinking like the achievement of building a statue or something, right? Seems like there's kind of a bottom. There's like, I make zero I have zero value in this achievement, and then it just goes up from there. I can't think like, maybe I failed to get the materials, and that's like the worst, thing. It's not clear that I can go like that. There's negative value. There might be kind of a floor, zero value, and then it just goes positive from there. Not sure about that, but if that's the case, then maybe some of the impossibility theorems, like the ones that depend on sadistic inclusion type into it, comparisons of negative, adding lives of negative welfare versus lives of positive welfare, can sort of be avoided. I guess one thing you could say is, when you look at those cases, Scheffler could say, well, I'm not talking about the value of humanity as a whole. I'm just talking about like the flourishing aspect that has to do with achievements. So maybe you can't get me on those comparisons. That's possible. I mean, it doesn't affect your overall point, I think, but I guess maybe the general point is just that how it's related to Johan's point, maybe like how bad the impossibility theorems will change depending on like how we understand flourishing and like what the value bearers are. So that's one point. But then the second point is, you could extend your criticism, I think, of Scheffler a little bit, because he has these two different ideas in his work. One is about flourishing and the value of humanity, but he's also interested in, the meaning of our lives, the present generation, and how that depends on the value of future generations and the ongoing, humanity, extending indefinitely into the future. So there is a kind of like meaning, or maybe even a welfare aspect in his view. And he's not very clear on how exactly the value of humanity like determines the meaning, like the meaningness or the meaning level of our lives. But if it's a straightforward connection where, the more flourishing future, humanity is in the future, the more meaning our lives get, or something like that, then everything you say about humanity can also translate over into like meaning levels. Or and if I don't remember if he uses the term well-being, but if he does, he could even be well-being, and then he's definitely got some commitments in what looks like population axiology, or something very similar to it. You can imagine just one life, maybe it's mine, right? And now how much meaning does my life have depending on how the future goes? Well, if it's very flourishing, then maybe my life is very meaningful, very good. If it's less flourishing, then less so, and so forth. And it seems like you can get some of the paradoxes that you want to get for flourishing for just like, meaning or well-being for individual lives as well.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Starting with the second comment. Yeah, so I think when he talks about the meaning of an individual life, depending on what happens in the future, so to speak, I think he has in mind sort of the collective enterprises that includes future people. So, it's the, providing some, giving your little, contributing to this sort of big philosophical project about finding the philosophical truths, whatever, right? That provides meaning to you, and meaning would be very little if it wasn't continued into the future. So it's definitely true that continuing into the future can be important, but it's more about that the activity, I guess it's sort of continued, and then I guess it's better if it's also reaching the end point when you have we actually found some truths in philosophy.
I see, but I think at some point
it's slightly different. It's not sort of the number of people and the individual levels of flourishing. It's more about the sort of collective enterprises, the value of them, I guess.
Okay, I thought at one point he says that but he is committed to the claim that what meaning it has for my life depends on this value that it has separately.
Yeah, so the value, as I understood it,
but you're saying the value is the value of some enterprise rather than
I thought he was more interested in this fact that sort of there are people in the future that are continuing this project you have an interest in, because you have an interest in that it's going to be achieved at some point, for instance, right? And that it can't be completely achieved in your lifetime, but you also want to contribute to that achievement during your lifetime, and then other will take over. But it's more about this enterprise being valuable.
Okay. Well, if the enterprise doesn't have a finish line, then maybe you can get then similar paradigm. Like maybe you mentioned time, right? So we can have units of time. And we can extend humanity more or less. And
no, that's true. Maybe the time, and of course you have the value then of the enterprise, and then is it more valuable to, is the process itself valuable, right? It's not just the achievement, right? Because then it would be very different. No, it's supposed to be valuable finally, or intrinsically, to take part in this sort of enterprise, which perhaps will not actually end up with a complete sort of as a complete success, right? But still, it might be guided by the right goals and so on, right? Like that. So there will be various features to take into account, but it's not this. I couldn't see how you could just translate it to the population.
Okay. Yeah, you'd have to have a separate
similar features has to be traded off, and I agree.
Yeah. Sounds like you would have to have a separate axiology or something for the enterprises.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's
okay.
true. Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. The first comment was about the withering. Yeah, so I think actually you asked the question last time I presented this paper.
Oh, I did.
No, so I agree that for certain flourishing states or flourishing aspects of an individual life, it's hard to think about the negative counterpart. But then, of course, flourishing needn't just be about accomplishment or achievements. As Aristotle, says that happiness sort of adds something, right, to the achievement, right? It's not unimportant, but it's not. But the happiness without achievement, it's not anything to think. It's making your life more flourishing. But happiness, in addition to the achievement, is making it more flourishing.
Yeah, so I just think I just want to hear more about the flourishing part, and that's
exactly.
from Scheffler.
On you're right. So on some accounts, I think Herca's actually own account, there's no negative value, right? I think.
Okay, and is that because he has like a kind of perfectionist?
Yeah. So some accounts, correct? They will. I can only use the positive side, so to speak. But of course, there are paradoxes on that side too to take into account. But even if you do that, if you look at the this AB, right? You can, you still have to sort of think about, well, if you have a critical level, let's say alpha there, and then you sort of can either add lots of people flourishing, definitely flourishing, right? Or you can add few that are really, really on the borderline for flourishing. Right, you can see that. Well, why should I go for adding the few that will be really above the level of flourishing? So you can have a sort of, not the same strength. I agree with you one here too, right? It wouldn't be the same kind of pull because you don't have this polarity here, right? Difference, but it's still sort of adding much less, fewer, much less flourishing lives rather than many definitely flourishing lives. Yeah.
I see. So okay. So the structure of this example doesn't necessarily depend. Not necessarily, on
because you can sort of it's
about
being under
level.
the line, right? And then the fact that you add up these small differences, and
yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah.
But it's not. I agree with you and you too. Perhaps it's not the same intuitive sort of counterintuitiveness now, as in, but it's not sadistic. Right? Sadistic has to do with this negative, adding negative value. Right? It's just being less sympathetic or something, or not sadistic.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a word for like being happy about failures. So if we're thinking about achievement or something, the failure loving.
Yeah, so the withering, I think some people do believe. I mean, it's species. The people into the flourishing of species, of course, do believe that species can, or both animals and plants can wither, right? Not just be more or less.
Yeah, but when I think of withering, again, this is just a linguistic intuition, but when I think of withering and flourishing, I don't see like withering as kind of the negative of flourishing where they're separated by a neutral level. I think more of like if something is not really flourishing very much, it could also be withering to a great degree and so forth. But that's just a linguistic intuition.
No, that's true. Yeah, right. Yeah, I actually haven't.
So I have a withering plant in my living room, but it may be flourishing a tiny bit, like a little bit. It's like a little sprout coming out of the.
Yeah, but it might be overall withering.
Overall withering, right.
Yeah, so that's. I mean, so people, if the size of the species or population of the species matters for flourishing, it can be too small to maintain the critical level, right? So it might not be flourishing if you give a lot of weight to that part of life. You can say this is not a flourishing population. They won't be able to maintain that, the critical mass or critical size.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's withering because they're slowly dying out. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much or maybe Tim, you can.
We can do the applause. Okay, and
thank you so much.
And then I have to do. I've never chaired one of these things before, so there are these closing duties. I have to say what's coming up. So, well, first of all, I want to say because this is a special seminar with the Rutgers Center for Population Level Bioethics. So I just want to say we really love that group, and we hope that this. Not only the regular open seminars for IFFS, but specifically our seminars with you guys will continue. So we look forward to that. Don't actually know when the next one of these is, but I think we have a closed seminar with you guys on, was it May? It's Kareem actually who's giving the talk on it. It's maybe May 20. Do you remember what date it is, Kareem? I'm failing at this, but
May 25.
May 25.
yes, May 25th. Okay, thank you. Oh, Monica is there. Okay, thanks. Great. So that's coming up. Also for the Institute, we have Professor Ottmar Edenhofer of the Climate Economics and Public Policy at Technische Universität in Berlin. That's on May 10th. And then we have Sarah Birch on May 24th. And another May seminar, but nobody has booked yet. So anyway, those are the announcements. That's what's coming up. So thanks everyone. And let's bring this to a close.
Thank you so much for really great comments. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye guys.
Good to see you all. Thanks, Krister.